In this final tutorial on the basic synthesizer architecture, we're going to cover LFOs. And we talked about LFOs at the very beginning, the very first video that we did. And during this video, we're going to finish that discussion. LFOs are very powerful devices. You remember in our first video that I mentioned that they are an oscillator as well. So we have an electronic oscillator that's generating our waveforms, like these waveforms here: square, sawtooth, sine, triangle waves. We also have a low frequency oscillator, or LFO. I mentioned that a low frequency oscillator is defined as a frequency that is less than 20 hertz. So right there, that tells you that you can't hear it because it's outside of our range of hearing. Remember, humans hear from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So 20 hertz and below is outside of our range of human hearing. So obviously it doesn't affect the sound as far as actually affecting the frequencies. So what we do is we use an LFO to modulate something else or affect another part of the sound. So an LFO is used to affect some part of the sound. There's a term that we use for that, and it's called modulation. When we are modulating something, we are affecting it in some way. So we use an LFO to modulate the sound. Let me give you an example. If we wanted to modulate pitch, so we wanted to modulate the pitch of our original electronic oscillator, we could do that using an LFO. So we would take an LFO and we would assign the LFO to modulate or affect the pitch. So essentially it would be like taking the LFO and having the LFO modulate or control or affect the pitch knob of the oscillator. So that would be one use of an LFO, would be to change the pitch of an oscillator. Another use of an LFO might be to create a tremolo effect. Okay, what's tremolo for you guitar players? Tremolo is the increasing or decreasing of the volume. So it's like grabbing onto the volume knob of your guitar and turning it up and down, up and down. Well, we could assign an LFO to do that same thing. We could assign an LFO to turn up or down the volume or gain control of our synthesizer. So LFO could control the volume of our synth. Now the rate or the frequency of the LFO is going to determine how fast that pitch vibrato happens, or the volume change, the tremolo effect on the guitar happens. If we're using a fast LFO, it's going to occur at a rapid rate. If we're using a very slow LFO, the tremolo or the pitch are going to change more gradually. So let's take a look at LFOs and how they can be used to change or affect part of the sound. So here I have my synth. Let's say, for example, I would like to modulate my pan. Okay, so I want my synthesizer to pan from left to right. I could assign the pan to be modulated by an LFO. Now you can see the LFO is going to be modulating the pan. And here we could change the speed of the LFO. Okay, so that LFO, if I'm doing that, I'm increasing the megahertz. You can see there it's up to 6, 8 hertz. So I have assigned the LFO to modulate the pan. If I increase my rate, I am increasing the frequency of my LFO. If I change the depth, I'm changing the amplitude of my LFO. So the depth tells it how much it moves to the left or right, and the rate tells us how fast it's going to go. The difference between this LFO and this LFO is that the rate is the same, it's just the amplitude of this waveform is much higher than this one. So what that's going to do is essentially, this is like turning up the depth knob. So it has greater depth, and this has a more shallow depth. So that's what we're doing when we change the depth. We are increasing the amplitude of the LFO. When we increase the rate, we are increasing the speed of the LFO. Using an LFO, we can also affect other things. Let's say, for example, we wanted to affect or have the LFO sweep the cutoff frequencies. We could do that as well. We could modulate the cutoff with an LFO. So now this cutoff frequency is being moved to the left or to the right by my LFO. Okay, I want less depth. Maybe I want to add a little resonance to that too. So there are a lot of ways that we can use an LFO to affect or change the sound of our synth. We're using an LFO to modulate some other parameter. We could modulate pitch, we can modulate pan, we can, generally speaking, depending on how current or modern the synth is that you're using, you can modulate almost anything. So modulation and LFOs as a means of modulation are two very powerful tools that can be used as we create new and interesting sounds with our synthesizers.